There are moments in life when something inside you pauses, even if the world around you keeps moving. Maybe it happens when the noise finally fades and your thoughts grow louder than the day ever allowed them to be. Maybe it happens in the middle of an ordinary moment, walking somewhere, scrolling your phone, or staring quietly at a ceiling while your mind drifts somewhere deeper than usual. And in that quiet space, a strange thought appears. Not a loud voice, not a dramatic sign, just a subtle feeling, a feeling that something in your life is about to change. Not the kind of change people post about online, not the shallow kind that comes and goes like trends. I'm talking about the kind of shift that rearranges the way your story unfolds. The kind of moment where later you look back and realize that was the turning point. And maybe, just maybe, something inside you has been sensing that for a while now. You might not have told anyone about it. In fact, you may have tried to ignore it, because when life has taught you to expect disappointment, hope can feel dangerous. Believing that something good is coming sometimes feels like setting yourself up for another fall. But still, the feeling doesn't leave. It lingers quietly, like the distant sound of thunder before a storm arrives. Not destructive thunder, but the kind that announces that the dry season is ending. Sometimes God moves in ways that no one expects, not loudly, not in ways that impress crowds at first, but in ways that completely rewrite the future of one life. And then another, and then another. History is full of moments like that. People who looked ordinary on the outside, people who were overlooked, misunderstood, or even dismissed by others, suddenly finding themselves standing in the middle of something they never could have planned. Not because they forced it. And if you have been feeling like life has been strangely preparing you, through moments that didn't make sense, through seasons that tested your patience, through silence that felt heavier than answers, then what you're about to hear might resonate more deeply than you expect. Because sometimes the most unexpected chapters begin quietly, before the door opens, before the breakthrough becomes visible, before anyone else sees it. There is a moment, almost invisible, where heaven begins arranging things behind the scenes. And what makes that moment so powerful is that most people have no idea it's happening. But a few people, the ones paying attention in their hearts, begin to feel it first. And tonight, as you sit here listening to this message, there is a possibility worth considering. What if the long season you've been walking through wasn't empty time? What if it was preparation? What if the delays, the confusion, the strange redirections were not signs that your story was falling apart, but signs that something was quietly being built underneath it all? Because there are moments when God does something so unexpected in a person's life that it leaves everyone around them stunned. Not because that person suddenly became different overnight, but because the process that nobody saw finally reaches its moment of reveal. And if that possibility feels strangely close to your own story, then stay with me, because the next of this message might help you understand why this season of your life has felt the way it has, and why what comes next might surprise more people than you realize. It's interesting how certain moments in life seem to arrive without explanation. You could have been doing anything a few minutes ago, watching something else, thinking about something completely unrelated. Yet somehow you ended up here, listening to these words. Some people would call that coincidence, but others, people who have walked through enough life to notice the quiet patterns of faith, sometimes wonder if moments like this are more about timing than randomness. because timing has a way of revealing things the heart has been trying to understand. Think about the season you've been in lately. Not just the visible parts of life, the daily routines, the responsibilities, the conversations you have with others. I'm talking about the inner season, the one most people around you don't fully see. The questions you've been carrying, the quiet reflections that come when no one else is around, the moments when you've looked at your life and thought, something has to change, but I'm not sure how. For many people, there comes a stretch of time where everything feels uncertain, not completely broken, but not settled either. It's like standing in a hallway between two rooms. The old chapter behind you, the next one not fully open yet, and that space can feel uncomfortable. You may have noticed yourself becoming more reflective lately. Things that used to distract you easily don't hold your attention the same way anymore. Conversations that once felt normal and now sometimes feel shallow. Even your own thoughts have been shifting in ways you didn't expect. At times, it may have even made you feel a little different from the people around you. Not better, not worse, just different, and that feeling can be confusing. Because when life begins nudging someone toward deeper awareness, it rarely announces itself clearly. It begins subtly, through restlessness, through reflection, through moments when your spirit senses that there's more to your story than what you're currently seeing. In the Bible, there are many stories where this kind of quiet stirring happened before something important unfolded. One example comes from the life of Joseph. Long before his circumstances changed, long before the dreams he received made sense, he found himself walking through seasons that looked nothing like the future God eventually revealed. From the outside, Joseph's life looked like a series of setbacks, betrayal by his own brothers, years of being misunderstood, long periods where it seemed like his life had taken the wrong turn, completely. But when the story is read from beginning to end, something becomes clear. Those seasons weren't meaningless. They were in Book of Genesis, Joseph later reflects on everything that happened to him and says something remarkable. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. That perspective didn't come over. It came from someone who slowly realized that even the confusing parts of life can carry purpose that only becomes visible later. And maybe that's why this moment feels familiar to you, because lately you may have been looking back at certain experiences in your life, experiences that once felt random or painful, and beginning to wonder if they were shaping you in ways you didn't recognize at the time. The truth is, spiritual awareness rarely arrives through comfort alone. Often, it grows in the middle of questions, in the moments when a person begins searching more deeply for meaning, when they start noticing that life isn't just about surviving each day, but about understanding what their journey is teaching them. So if something about this message made you pause, if you felt a quiet pull to listen a little longer, it may not be because you were looking for answers. It may be because something within you is already starting to wake up to a deeper perspective, and that awakening usually begins for a reason. But to understand that reason fully, we have to talk honestly about something many people carry silently. The struggles that rarely get spoken out loud. There is a side of your life that most people never truly see. Not because you're trying to hide it, but because some experiences are simply too difficult to explain to someone who hasn't lived them with you. On the surface, you may appear calm. You show up when you need to. You handle responsibilities. You speak kindly to people. From the outside, it might even look like everything is under control. But the deeper story, the one written in quiet moments, carries more weight than anyone realizes. There have been days when you felt misunderstood, even in rooms full of people who know your name. Moments when you tried to express what was on your heart, but the words didn't come out the way you hoped. Or worse, they were heard but not truly understood. That kind of loneliness is different from simply being alone. It's the feeling of standing in your own life, yet somehow sensing that no one else fully sees the battles you're fighting internally. Some battles are invisible. The doubts you wrestle with when plans fall apart. The disappointment when someone you trusted shows a different side of themselves. The quiet pressure of wondering if you're moving in the right direction, or if you somehow missed an important turn along the way. Sometimes the struggle isn't dramatic at all. It's slow, subtle, a steady accumulation of moments where things didn't unfold the way you hoped. And after enough of those moments, something begins to happen inside a person. They start questioning themselves more than they used to. They become cautious with their expectations. They learn to carry certain emotions quietly so they don't burden others. You may have had nights where sleep didn't come easily, not because of noise, but because your mind kept revisiting conversations, decisions, or memories that still linger in your heart. And yet, despite everything, you kept going. You kept showing up. That says more about your strength than you may realize, because enduring silent battles requires a kind of resilience that the world rarely celebrates. There are no crowds applauding someone for surviving a difficult season. No announcements when a person chooses to keep believing even after disappointment. But faith often grows in those quiet places. In fact, many of the most meaningful spiritual transformations in history began in seasons where everything seemed uncertain. Take the story of David before he ever became king. I can think about David. They often picture the courage he showed against Goliath, or the leadership he eventually displayed over a nation. But those moments came later. Long before any of that happened, David spent years in obscurity, watching over sheep in open fields while others overlooked him. Living a life that to most people looked small and uneventful. Yet those quiet years were shaping something within him. Patience, courage, reflection, and perhaps most importantly, a deep trust in God that was built far away from public attention. Your life may not look like David's story in obvious ways, but the emotional landscape can feel surprisingly similar. Seasons where you feel unseen, moments where you wonder if your efforts matter, times when it feels like others are moving ahead while you remain in a place that looks unchanged. Those experiences can make a person feel forgotten, but faith invites a different perspective. What if some of the hardest seasons in your life were not signs of abandonment, but seasons where something essential was being formed within you? Strength that only comes from perseverance, wisdom that grows from reflection, compassion that develops when you understand what struggle feels like, because people who have walked through quiet storms often carry a depth that cannot be learned any other way. And if your life has contained those kinds of hidden battles, then the next of this message might help explain something important. Sometimes the most difficult chapters of a person's story are not the end of the story. Sometimes they are the moment right before awakening begins. There comes a moment in many people's lives when the way they see everything begins to shift. Not dramatically at first. It doesn't feel like a sudden lightning strike of clarity. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost like the slow arrival of morning light after a long night. At first, the darkness is still there, but gradually the outlines of things become clearer. For a long time, You may have interpreted certain events in your life as setbacks, missed opportunities, closed doors, moments when things didn't work out the way you hoped they would. And naturally, when enough of those experiences pile up, a person can begin to wonder if something is wrong, if perhaps they simply weren't meant for more than what they're currently seeing. But spiritual awakening often begins when a person looks back at their life with new eyes. Instead of only seeing what was lost, they begin noticing what was built inside them along the way. The patience you learned when answers took longer than expected. The emotional strength that developed after disappointment. The ability to understand others more deeply because you know what struggle feels like. Those qualities don't appear instantly. They are formed slowly, often in seasons, when nothing seems to be changing on the outside. In Scripture, there are many moments where people discovered that hardship had been quietly preparing them for something they didn't yet understand. Think about the journey of Moses. Most people remember Moses for the extraordinary moment when he stood before the sea and watched the waters part. That moment is remembered as one of the most powerful demonstrations of faith in the entire Bible. But what's often overlooked is what came before it. Moses spent 40 years living in the quiet wilderness of Midian, far away from the palace where he once lived, far away from the destiny that would later unfold. To many observers, those years might have looked like a detour, or even a failure. Yet, in Book of Exodus, we see that it was during that very wilderness season that Moses encountered the moment that changed everything. The burning bush, where God called him toward a purpose far greater than he had imagined. What seemed like wasted time had actually been preparation. The wilderness shaped his humility. It taught him patience. It created space for him to listen more deeply. And when the moment arrived, Moses was no longer the same person he had been before those years. Sometimes spiritual awakening works in a similar way. A person begins to realize that the road they've been walking, even the difficult parts, has been shaping them in ways they couldn't see at the time. You may have noticed this happening within yourself recently. Perhaps your priorities are shifting. Things that once seemed incredibly important no longer carry the same weight. Meanwhile, deeper questions about meaning, faith, and direction have started rising to the surface. You might find yourself reflecting more than before, seeking quiet moments, thinking about how your life aligns with your values, wondering what God may be guiding you toward in the future. This doesn't mean you suddenly have every answer. Spiritual awakening rarely works like. Instead, it feels more like the beginning of a conversation, a gradual awareness that your life is part of something larger than you once realized. And interestingly, many people notice this awakening right before a significant shift begins unfolding in their story, not because they forced the change, but because the inner transformation prepared them to recognize opportunities and directions they may have overlooked before. Faith has a way of working from the inside outward. First, the heart begins to change. Then, perspective changes. And eventually, circumstances begin to move in ways that once seemed impossible. If that process has quietly begun within you, then the next of this journey becomes especially meaningful, because spiritual awakening is often accompanied by something else, wisdom that has been passed down through generations of faith, wisdom that helps people understand how God often moves during the most unexpected seasons of life. When people search for meaning during uncertain seasons, many eventually return to a source that has guided countless lives for centuries. The quiet wisdom found in Scripture. not because every answer appears instantly on the page, but because within those ancient words there are patterns of human experience that feel surprisingly familiar. Struggle, waiting, doubt, hope. The Bible never pretends that life is simple. Instead, it tells honest stories about people who wrestled with uncertainty before. They ever witnessed the promises that later defined their lives. One verse that many people find themselves returning to during difficult seasons appears in Book of Romans Shabbat. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. At first glance, that sentence can sound comforting but distant. When someone is in the middle of confusion or disappointment, it's not always easy to believe that everything happening around them could somehow serve a greater purpose. But the deeper meaning of this verse becomes clearer when we look at the lives of the people who lived it. Consider again the story of Joseph. Joseph's early life was filled with dreams that hinted at something significant in his future. Yet almost immediately after those dreams appeared, his life took a series of painful turns. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, later imprisoned despite his integrity. Every step seemed to move him further away from the future he once imagined. Years passed before anything, and during those years, Joseph had no way of knowing that God was quietly positioning him in the exact place where his story would eventually unfold. When the moment finally arrived, Joseph found himself standing before the ruler of Egypt, interpreting a dream that would alter the fate of an entire nation. Eventually, he was placed in a position where he could save countless lives. During a devastating famine, the journey that once looked like a series of losses suddenly made sense. The betrayal, the prison, the waiting. None of those chapters had been wasted. That story echoes a deeper principle that appears throughout Scripture, that God often works through processes that only reveal their meaning in hindsight. Another example appears in Book of Isaiah, where God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." Those words remind us of something both humbling and hopeful. Humbling, because it acknowledges that human understanding is limited. We often try to measure our lives by immediate outcomes, expecting clarity right away. But hopeful, because it suggests that God sees a much wider picture than we can at any single moment. Imagine looking at a massive tapestry from the backside. Up close, the threads might appear tangled and confusing, colors crossing in strange directions, patterns that don't seem to connect. But when the tapestry is turned around, a beautiful image appears. Many people discover later in life that their own story worked in a similar way. Moments that once felt like chaos begin forming a pattern. Delays that once felt frustrating reveal themselves as protection or preparation. This doesn't mean every painful experience becomes easy to understand. Faith doesn't erase the reality of hardship, but Scripture invites us to view life through a longer lens, to trust that God is capable of weaving meaning even through chapters that feel uncertain. And if you've been walking through a season where nothing seems fully clear yet, then perhaps this wisdom is arriving at the right time. Because sometimes right before a new chapter opens, a person begins noticing something unusual. Certain memories start resurfacing, past experiences suddenly, and life itself begins to feel like it has been quietly guiding you towards something you haven't fully recognized yet. In the next of this We'll explore something very real that many people experience during these moments. The way every day, life begins revealing small clues that your story may be moving in a direction you never expected. There is a point in many people's journeys where faith stops feeling like a distant idea and starts becoming something woven into ordinary life, not in dramatic miracles every day, but in quiet realizations. You begin noticing how certain experiences shaped you in ways you couldn't have predicted. Conversations that once seemed random suddenly stand out in your memory. Encounters with people, some encouraging, some painful, begin to feel like pieces of a larger story. Real life has a way of teaching lessons that books alone cannot. Maybe you've experienced moments where you gave your best effort towards something. A job, a relationship, a plan you truly believed would work, only to watch it fall apart despite everything you did. Those moments can leave a person questioning everything. You might have asked yourself, why did I try so hard if it was going to end this way? But time has a strange way of revealing what those moments were actually doing within you. Perhaps that difficult job taught you resilience. Perhaps that relationship showed you the value of honesty and boundaries. Perhaps that closed door redirected you toward a path you never would have considered otherwise. At the time, none of that felt comforting. It felt frustrating. It felt confusing. But looking back now, you may realize that those experiences refined your perspective in ways that comfort never could have. Faith often grows through real life, through the ordinary routines and unexpected turns that shape who we become. Think about the way many people begin their day. An alarm clock rings. There are responsibilities waiting, bills to pay, work to complete, people depending on them. Life moves forward in small, practical steps that rarely feel dramatic. Yet inside those simple routines, deeper questions can begin to rise. Is this all there is? Am I moving towards something meaningful? What is God shaping in my life right now? These questions usually don't appear when everything feels perfectly comfortable. They appear when a person senses that their life is meant to grow beyond what they currently understand. In Scripture, even people who were deeply faithful had moments where they wrestled with these same reflections. One powerful example comes after experiencing an incredible victory against false prophets. Elijah found himself exhausted and discouraged, retreating into the wilderness. In that quiet place, he expected God to appear in dramatic ways, through wind, earthquakes, or fire. But in First Book of Kings, Surjot Sha'ar, something surprising happens. God does not reveal himself through the loudest forces. Instead, Elijah encounters what Scripture describes as a gentle whisper. That moment carries a message that still resonates today. Sometimes God's guidance doesn't arrive in overwhelming signs. Instead, it appears in the quiet nudges within our hearts, the subtle moments of clarity that emerge when we pause long enough to listen. You may have experienced that kind of whisper recently. A thought that keeps returning. A desire to move in a different direction. A quiet sense that your life may be entering a new chapter, even if the details are still unclear. These moments often begin small. They appear during reflection, during prayer, during a quiet walk, or an unexpected conversation. But when someone pays attention to those whispers, something remarkable can begin to happen. Their perspective shifts. Instead of viewing life only through the lens of problems and obstacles, they start noticing opportunities for growth. Moments where faith can shape their response instead of fear. This doesn't mean every day suddenly becomes easy. Life remains complex, but the way you walk through it begins to change. And that inner shift That subtle transformation of perspective is often the first sign that something deeper is happening within your story. In the next of this message, we'll explore what happens when a person begins to truly see their life differently. When the struggles they once carried start transforming into a new kind of strength and clarity. There is a moment in many people's lives that doesn't look extraordinary from the outside. No headlines, no dramatic announcement, no sudden spotlight. Yet inside that moment, something begins to settle in the heart. It's the realization that your life has not been random. The struggles you endured, the patience you learned during long waiting seasons, the quiet resilience you built when no one else understood your battles. All of it has been shaping the person you are becoming. And suddenly, you begin to see your past with different eyes. The disappointment that once felt like failure may have been protection. The delay that once felt unbearable may have been preparation. The silence that once made you feel forgotten may have been the space where your faith was quietly growing deeper than you realized. There is a passage in Book of Psalms, Sans Wu, that says, "Weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning." Those words carry a quiet promise. Night seasons do exist. Moments of confusion do happen. Periods of waiting are part of the human journey. But they are not the whole story. Morning always arrives eventually. And sometimes the most surprising thing about that morning is not just the change in circumstances, but the change within you. You begin to recognize strength you didn't know you had. You notice wisdom that only came through experience. You realize that your faith is no longer based only on hope for the future, but also on everything you've already survived. That kind of faith is steady. It doesn't need to shout. It simply continues forward with quiet confidence. Perhaps that is where you are right now, standing at the edge of a new chapter without fully seeing what lies ahead. Yet, and that's okay, because faith has never required a person to see the entire road before taking the next step. It only asks for trust. One step at a time. So if something inside you has been sensing that life is shifting, if you felt that quiet, stirring that something meaningful may be unfolding, allow yourself to stay open to that possibility. Continue paying attention to the quiet guidance that comes through prayer, reflection, and the wisdom God places in your path. Sometimes the most remarkable chapters of a person's story begin when they decide not to give up during the uncertain moments, when they choose faith instead of fear, when they keep walking forward even without all the answers. And if this message resonated with you in some way, if it felt like it spoke to something you've been carrying silently, take a moment right now, pause, breathe, reflect on where your life has been and where it might be going. You may discover that the story unfolding in front of you is far more meaningful than you once believed. And before you go, I'd like to ask you something simple. If this message spoke to your heart, write the word faith in the comments below, not as a performance for anyone else, but as a small declaration for yourself that you are choosing to keep trusting the journey God is leading you through. And if you know someone who might need encouragement tonight, share this message with them. You never know when a few thoughtful words might arrive at exactly the right moment in someone's life. Remember this, your story is still unfolding. Your strength has been growing quietly, and the chapter ahead may hold more purpose than you can currently see. Stay patient, stay hopeful, and keep walking forward with faith.